it's an obvious point, but like I never hesitate to make it. Like the people aren't the government, right? And in effect, like the governments of the world are just trying to divide us, right? But like when you sit down and you talk with people across, you realize that you both hate the government equally.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of the Ben Wehrman podcast. I appreciate you being here. Today we have Roger Wang, and I'm really excited to talk about this one because we haven't dove into anything about China or anything about CBDCs, which are two obviously huge topics in the world right now as we're looking toward the future economics, Bitcoin, Nostr. Seems like all of these things are really intertwined with China. Like there's a lot of use cases and experiments going on over there right now where all these things are happening, and it's quite interesting. So, Roger, really appreciate you being here to talk about this, man.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me on. It's always great to see good content out there, and I've been watching the show a little bit, see kind of like what you're doing with like Bitcoin Nostr stuff. Always love it when someone's actually on Nostr and they're doing
Yes.
pods. So always great to see.
And you've been writing some killer articles on Nostr too. We'll definitely talk about that as well. So why don't we get just a quick background on your story? What is your sort of upbringing into the Bitcoin world and how you got into all this stuff?
Yeah, so I was born in China, but moved fairly early to the United States and Canada. And then what happened was I was growing up in Montreal. I'd been going to McGill University and everything like that in economics. And I was kind of doing this thing where I was going back and forth between China. I'd spend like, maybe a month or something like that every year. And while I was in Montreal, it was kind of interesting. Montreal is kind of like this really interesting kind of like birthplace of a lot of different things. Like most people don't realize one of the co-founders of Blockstream was actually based out of Montreal. And also they had a Bitcoin embassy come up. I think that was one of the first physical spaces that were really explaining Bitcoin to the rest of the world. So yeah, it was like a very vibrant kind of scene. And I had been, because of this like unique position, I want to say that like there's many reasons that I gravitated towards Bitcoin, but at the beginning, it was more of a mystery. But I think I kind of reasoned through things by writing about it. And so as early as 2014, I started writing about it. There was kind of this confluence of the Montreal Bitcoin scene, as we're talking about, which is still going to a certain degree. There's a Canadian Bitcoin conference that will happen there later on this year. As well, going back and forth between China and Canada a little bit. I think it gave me a little bit of perspective on like why this was needed a little bit more, like being part of all these digital communication systems. And I remember I used to like work in China, not for like Chinese companies, but for remote companies. So you always have to figure out like the VPN, like things are censored. It's very hard to talk with people across China and the West, let's say. So yeah, these all kind of led me towards this rabbit hole, and I've just, as you've alluded to, continued just writing about it since I guess now it's been, wow, crazy thing, about like 11 years.
Awesome. And what are the things that you are noticing? I guess I'm just curious, like among the Chinese people, like to the level that you're able to keep a finger on the pulse over there. I
Hmm.
know that actually one of the things that you said on a podcast I listened to recently is that the easiest next billion for Bitcoin is China. So could you elaborate on that, why you believe that there's so much potential there for this?
Yeah, I mean, first thing, I always elaborate on this just to like to clarify. But of course, if you want to get perspective on like 1.3 billion people, you can't just start and stop at me. Hopefully, so I have my own perspective and my own story. So that's kind of like where this is coming from. But having talked to a bunch of people, and I should mention I wrote a book about Bitcoin in China. That might be one reason. I'm just gonna put this up there. Would Mao hold Bitcoin? And that's actually been a really cool way for people, even mainlanders, kind of come up to me sometimes, and they talk through what they think and things like that. So I've been getting a little bit more of those perspectives actually as time has gone on. Listen, like I think first of all, just kind of like what you mentioned, you had said that the podcast hadn't covered China before, and that's not really surprising to me. Like we don't necessarily see a lot of coverage of what's going on. And I think it's kind of frankly pretty interesting what's happening. in China and with Chinese people when it comes to Bitcoin. The reason why I said Chinese people are the easiest next billion is because they already are buying Bitcoin, even though it is pretty much kind of illegal. And we can go into that why that's hard to do. There's like no public pairings, there's an exchanges ban, all this other stuff. Um, but they're kind of using it for different things. And, you know, I'm part of the Bitcoin community as well, and we can sit here and kind of judge it. But the reality is that a lot of Chinese people are taking funds out of the Chinese system and they're doing different things with it, right? Now, there's very few of them that are Bitcoin maxis, I would say. The ones who are really cool. And they actually post on Nostr as well, which is also really cool to see. But even the people who are kind of like the average, you know, they're like buying Tether, they're buying Bitcoin, they're kind of trading it for different altcoins or shit coins, as you might call them. You know, they're like super NFT heavy and stuff like that. I think what people need to realize is that in a Chinese context, that's like kind of an act of rebellion of sorts. I don't want to openly say that, but like basically, I don't want to like harp on it too much, but essentially, since China has, for your viewers, has a lot of restrictions on how you can take your money in and out of the system. So the most famous example is for most Chinese people, you know, they can only take 50,000 USD a person a year of foreign currency out. And they have to kind of like talk to the central bank essentially and say like, I need the money for like tourism. I need the money for this or that. So there's a lot of restrictions on that. And of course, Bitcoin, and Tether, and that's another thing that we can talk about a little bit too, offer an alternative to that, right? It's a world where the government doesn't get to determine how you spend your money or how you take your money out. So I think it's already kind of happening a little bit, but I do think that if we talk to, you know, if Bitcoiners talked more to the Chinese communities, they got a little bit more of a sense of what was going on, like how they think about it. You know, Chinese people seem to be very NGU oriented, and that makes sense if you think about the fact that China's economy, which we might talk about a little bit later, is not doing so well right now. And so if you're trying to invest in the Chinese economy, things are going very poorly for you. Like, you know, your shares are down, your real estate are down, everything's down. So this like Bitcoin is already kind of like a compelling alternative and a compelling hedge, even in the way that it's presented. And I think with just a little bit more of like connection and community and like understanding where the Chinese mentality is coming from, that's why I kind of put it out there that I think the next easiest next billion is China.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I'd be very curious to just hear your thoughts on just a 10,000-foot view of the Chinese economic situation as a whole right now. I know you said that you don't think it's very good, and it's this strange phenomenon where no matter which country you go to, which people you talk to, everyone's saying, "Oh, everything's chaotic and crazy and bad." It seems like it's happening everywhere. So, how would you describe the current Chinese economic situation, maybe in comparison with the U.S., for those listeners to kind of know where we're both standing?
Yeah, I mean, Ben, I think one of the reasons why you're hearing that, I mean, the fiat world is kind of unwinding around us, to be honest. There is a sovereign debt crisis, so this is not just unique to China. But of course, talking about China specifically, um, you know, China and the United States are in very different places, and and I think this is coming up as you alluded to with the tariffs. Right now, there's like an escalating like tit for tat. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that though. The 10,000 foot view is that China's economy before the tariffs was already going through a lot of increasing unemployment, especially among young people. So there seems to be a really high amount of youth unemployment. At some points, you know, 20, 23%. These are stats that you would have seen like when Europe had a huge crisis and there was a huge youth unemployment crisis. That's pretty much the same numbers. You're looking at almost like a generation of people that are basically jobless or purposeless, you know. And in China, when you talk about like these numbers scale to a vast degree. Like, don't forget 1.3, 1.4 billion people. Like, you take 20% of that, that's like hundreds of millions of people right there. Of course, it's like a subsegment of a subsegment. But my point is that in China, the large numbers are the large numbers, right? Like really big numbers. Um, and it's hard to comprehend sometimes, even on a scale. Um, so, unlike the United States basically, which has, I guess, surfaced recently, really runs what economists call a capital account surplus and a trade deficit. And what that really means at the base of it is that the United States buys more things than it sells to other countries. And, and as a result, the US dollar is kind of floating around the world. That's what it really means. Like, if you want to really break it down. China is has been ascending in its world in the economy. The reason why it's been growing so quickly in the past is because it's been export led, and so it has figured out that if it can consolidate the manufacturing base, it can sell into the system, and then it gets U.S. dollars. Um, Now that has suffered a bit because the Chinese Communist Party kind of goes through different phases. And at certain points in time, it likes to remember that it's a communist party in ideology. And so it goes after certain sectors. And one sector it went after pretty hard in the last few years was housing. And so there was a lot of talk about how housing was for people and not for speculation, right? And the issue with that is that, if that happens, there's kind of like a little bit of a real estate bubble, and you started seeing property developers go bankrupt and things like that. And in China, a lot of people put their savings into housing. That's the first thing. And secondly, it's kind of this like really weird system where quite a few people will pay for houses like pre-starts. And so they'll pay a deposit. And then once the pre-start is built, then they'll pay a mortgage on it. And so you're looking at a situation where the real estate bubble is kind of collapsing, especially in like the more prominent kind of cities like Shanghai and other places like that. And what that's led to is basically demand destruction, which is a fancy term of saying there's essentially a recession happening. Or in China's case, it's not really a recession because there's not negative economic growth. But what's happening is Chinese economic growth is slowing a lot. Now it's struggling to reach like 5% GDP growth per year. We're talking about an economy that used to like consistently average double digit GDP growth. Of course, Chinese government stats, we don't know. Some of it seems, manicured at best. But from even their own stats, it seems to show this consistent story of like, oh wow, like the economy is suffering. And from what I'm hearing, that's panning out. Like there are people who are getting laid off. A lot of people are scared for their jobs. In China, also right now, because I've been asked about this, there isn't per se inflation. So the rest of the world has been kind of going through inflation, right? During this time period in the last 5 years, let's say. And in China, actually, it's been kind of a little bit the opposite. But it's not the kind of deflation, it's, aside from a couple of sectors, for example, electric vehicles. I do think there China has a manufacturing advantage that they've been playing out. But aside from those sectors, this deflation seems to be caused by the fact that people are just spending less, but in a way that the way that Chinese. Now we talk a lot about how in a Bitcoin standard, that's a good thing. For example, Jeff Booth talks about that. It just reflects the fact that technological innovation is driving prices down, right? But in China, it seems to be mostly reflecting the fact that the economy has been stage managed for so long, and now it's coming down, and people are refusing to spend, not because prices are going down per se, although they are to a certain degree, especially in the sectors I mentioned, but more because they seem like they're scared. Like consumer confidence is very low, and so therefore you're kind of stuck in this cycle: people getting fired and real estate property going down, and also asset prices such as the Shanghai Stock Composite Exchange going down as well. So let me know, Ben, if you want to rein me in, but that's kind of like the 10,000 foot view. If I want to summarize that, prices are going down. There seems to be slowing economic growth. People seem to be afraid. And, assets across the board are decreasing in price.
Gotcha. And so one of the things I wanted to highlight there was you talk about how the USA is a net buyer And another way that I would sort of put that, and maybe you could tweak this since you understand it better than me, but we essentially declared that us as Americans, we are the global reserve currency. The dollar is a global reserve currency.
Yeah.
Everyone in the world has to use that as for settling trade. And so that gives us this wonderful power of just throwing our dollars all over the place, which we can print. And we
Yeah.
get all of your guys' apps for the Chinese, Japanese, Korean, like everywhere. We get their actual stuff. So we just like send our dollars everywhere, and we bring back all these cars and washing machines and phones and trinkets. And we're in a situation where America is full of all this stuff imported from all over the world, and
Mm.
meanwhile, all these other countries just have a big pile of dollars.
Uh-huh.
And I have to imagine that they're kind of wondering, did we get the best side of the deal here? We have a pile of this piece of paper that
Yeah.
is continuing to inflate away, and America just keeps spending trillions and trillions on wars all over the place, making their dollars worth even less that they have. So what are these countries thinking right now? Are they starting to think that maybe they should be looking at a different form of currency to be using, maybe Bitcoin?
Yes. Yeah. So, what's essentially been happening is that most people, what you described is basically correct, right? Like essentially, like the U.S. Has been subsidized as like a consumer economy. And there's a lot of really interesting research on the implications of that. Because Ben, I know you've also looked at like fixing the food and all this other stuff. Like this has dramatic implications, not only just for, the fact that there's this consumerist ethos, right? The American consumer has basically been the prop of the global economy, has also some lifestyle, cultural, health, and all kinds of other implications that we can, but that's just something to think about as well. Um, to specifically address your question, though, the China, I think, was actually one of the countries that realized this pretty early on. That so essentially, what's been happening is that because the American consumer has been buying so many goods, countries have been getting U.S. dollars in return, and they've mostly chosen. Now we don't necessarily know. So, for example, China, the composition of foreign reserves is a state secret. So we don't exactly know. But from what we do understand, China has recirculated a lot of that money into US debt, right? And actually, in fact, another country that does this at scale is Japan. So not just China, by the way, that does this, Japan does this as well. I think Japan has been actually much slower on the uptake on this because up to until now, the United States has not been like openly aggressive or hostile. Although I would point out that in the 80s, the US did apply sanctions to Japan when they had their own semiconductor industry go up. So, sometimes you're seeing history repeat itself. But, anyways, they implemented tariffs and also trade restrictions as well when Japan seemed to be getting more competitive on the semiconductor front as well as vehicles back in the 80s and 90s. So China, what China's realized is that, and I don't know how early they've realized this, but they have been acting accordingly, which is exactly to your point. The United States is probably not a very reliable, uh, country, especially if you're China, because China is always the one that gets the brunt of, the first Trump administration. They had to sign like a phase one, phase two trade
China.
deal. Huh?
China.
Yeah, exactly. China, or I can't even pronounce it like he does, but whatever. Like, they realize they're always going to get the brunt of it, and so they've shifted. How it's like Belt and Road Initiative and all this other stuff. Really, what that? So the Belt and Road Initiative for quickly for your audience is basically China spending the dollars it's getting, the foreign reserves, in order to like put loans to other countries with collateral backing it. So to give you an example, like El Salvador, BRI has funded a ton of stuff, including they've also given grants actually. But usually the way it works is like they give like infrastructure loans that are backed by collateral, and namely like some kind of national asset. So for example, a seaport or something like that. And that's like a way for them to recirculate their US dollars and their foreign exchange reserves in a way that gives them more hard power, if that makes sense. Because what I think China's realized is like they were holding a ton of debt. Like even in 2008, 2009, they were holding a bunch of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mae debt. If we remember, those were kind of like the government agencies that held a lot of subprime mortgages, right? And I think China's just realized like that's just like not a really good play for a number of different reasons. So they've been trying to shift it more into hard assets, right? And namely, what that means is the central bank has been trying to buy gold and shipping it to itself. The central bank has been trying to buy farmland. The Chinese state has been trying to recirculate out of U.S. debt and U.S. treasuries. And some of this, I know we didn't want to talk too much about the tariffs, but some of this is what you're seeing in the market now. Is I actually think it's a combination of Japan and China, and I actually think it's more Japan because I think China has realized this since like 2008 or at least maybe even earlier, and has just been acting on it. But basically, they're like, wow, like we have there. So Japan and China, by the way, are the two largest holders of U.S. Treasuries, aside from I think maybe the Fed. But like they're the largest two, like largest foreign countries that hold treasuries. Um, and we can talk about this later. But by the way, Tether is getting up there. Tether is like one of the highest, which is kind of crazy to think about as well. Um, and so they, have a lot of incentive to dump these treasuries now, especially Japan, actually, honestly. And so that's kind of why you're seeing this like weird world where normally when the stock market goes down, at a very basic level, bond prices go up because the idea is that people are going to, go from stocks into bonds. Now, bonds have an inverse relation. That's like what they teach you in Finance 101. I still have trigger memories from McGill days. But basically, bonds have an inverse relationship with price, namely that the bond yield and the price are inverse. What does that mean? That means that if the bond price goes down, the yield goes up. And a very easy way to think about this is that bonds are need to be increasing the interest rate they offer to be more attractive if there's less demand for it, right? That's like kind of the intuitive way to think about it. And so we're seeing this market where the stock market's going down, or we did see that at least for like that last week. And then obviously there's been that rally and everything. But what we did see is that coupled with treasury yields going up, namely the price was going down. And this was like a record amount of like the yields going up at the same time. And what that means is that not only were shares getting dumped, but treasuries were getting dumped. And from what I'm hearing or seeing in different sources, like reportedly, that is Japan and China are actually dumping those treasuries. So, China has long since realized that exchange has been trying to diversify into hard assets in a way that consolidates its power, hedges it against the United States, because it's always been kind of a hostile or semi-hostile player. Japan, I think, is the one that's in for a rude awakening. They've kind of been just holding treasuries, and they think like that's been a great strategy for them. And now it's like, maybe since now we're also a part of this whole tariff war, that's maybe not a great idea.
So, has there been any buzz about them getting into Bitcoin? Because all we hear about China, and maybe we could quickly touch on this, but how many times now has China tried to ban Bitcoin? Isn't it in the teens?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I wrote a book about it that has the timeline, right? So would Mao hold Bitcoin? And I actually have a resource. So if your viewers go to this site called ChinaBitcoinBook.com, I actually go into how Bitcoin got stronger after each ban, basically, and the different rounds of bans. Because yeah, like it's really confusing, because even today, Chinese courts still see Bitcoin as property, and so they're not like going after everybody who holds Bitcoin and are like, we're seizing it on behalf of the state, right? Like, so when you say Bitcoin ban, one of the things about Bitcoin that makes it so unique and, in my opinion, wonderful, is that it is really hard to ban. Like, how can you ban people passing numbers to each other, right? Like at space, right? Like, how can you ban someone like holding numbers in their head or on paper or whatever form they want to take, right? The answer is you can't. And China has tried really hard to do that. So we can talk about, like, I think there's like three bands that are probably like the most relevant. Like, I know, you're alluding to, I don't know, there's like been like, if you counted each step of the way, and I also think the media cycle incentivizes that, because like every time you're kind of like, hey, like every time China does something that kind of restricts Bitcoin, you're like, China has banned Bitcoin again. China has banned, so it became kind of a little bit more of a meme, and that got a lot of clicks and views. I think that there are probably three major things that happened. Like one is in 2013, China first signaled its disapproval of Bitcoin, which is fairly important because at that point, the Chinese tech scene, they actually were kind of embracing Bitcoin pretty early. Like people forget, but Baidu was one of the first companies to accept Bitcoin for payment for some of its cloud services. Baidu is this big search engine. It's kind of like the Google of China. And they were one of the first companies to accept it. But they had to stop because the Chinese government put its foot down. And in 2013, basically started putting out these regulations saying the banking system couldn't work with Bitcoin and all this other stuff. But what was more important was that it was the Chinese government saying, we don't approve of Bitcoin. And so that kind of chilled, there was a big sentiment, I think, of like, actually, I interviewed some of the OG Bitcoiners, and between like, I think 2012 and 2013, like people went from not knowing Bitcoin at all to like it being like a buzzy topic. Like you have these big tech Chinese companies that are starting to embrace it, right? But the 2013 was when the Chinese government really put its foot down. You could have guessed that the Chinese government was probably going to be against Bitcoin, but then it made its viewpoints really explicit there. It also in 2014, around that same time, made it clear that it was conducting research into the central bank digital currency. So you kind of see, and I know we were going to talk about that. So you kind of see the beginnings of that there. They also banned, so in 2021, I'm going to combine two things, because there's a lot of things in between. Like, for example, they banned ICOs and all this other stuff. But in 2021, they did two things that were fairly important. One was they made the exchanges ban, and really tied that together with law enforcement. So in fact, in China, although not a ton of people, this happened to like about 1,200 people per year or something, which is quite a bit. But basically, it is technically a crime, and that is not like a criminal thing, but like not like a civil thing, like a criminal thing, if you are buying Tether or if you are buying Bitcoin with Chinese yuan. So certainly, if you offer the services, you are also super liable. So what that's led to, and China is kind of an interesting country. So, sorry, I'm going to get a little bit technical here, but like for your audience, hopefully this is perspective opening or whatever. But in China, most people use VPNs, and VPNs are very, I don't know how much I have to get down there, but like basically like they're a way for you to like change your IP address. So in China, what that really means is you can get across the Great Firewall. Great Firewall is kind of this censorship wall. People can't use Google. They can't look up Tiananmen Square within mainland China, et cetera, all this other stuff. So the VPN ban works really similar to the exchanges ban. And the way it works is that if you're an individual, there are penalties, but like there isn't like a crazy amount. I mean, I've seen jail sentences like 6 months. That's not nothing. But at the same time, really where the Chinese state is trying to really censor is the companies that offer these services. So specifically the exchanges, they all had to leave China. Like there's a bunch of exchanges that were founded in China, including Binance. So Binance, Huobi, OKX, like all these old kind of exchanges. A lot of the founders either had to they had to make arrangements with the Chinese government, or they had to leave. Binance famously left for Hong Kong, then Malta, and other places, right? So this kind of exchanges ban basically prohibits people from going on to an exchange. And like in the West, right? Like for example, if you're buying Bitcoin, I don't know how your viewers are buying Bitcoin, but to give you a quick example, I imagine a fairly common flow is people will sign up for Coinbase, and then they will go and wire money from their bank account, and there's all this other stuff. In China, you can't do that. And so therefore, there is no public yuan to Bitcoin pairing is another consequence of that, right? Because there's no exchange that is willing to publicly offer, a yuan to Bitcoin pairing. Now, having said that, there are many ways around that, and I'm happy to talk about that if that's something that we want to get into.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? Some Chinese folks could be listening to this podcast through a VPN right now and want to hear some tips, maybe,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, I mean, I have a Forbes article that basically describes. I mean, basically, a Binance or exchanges like that, they'll have like an OTC department. So there's merchants that will sell Bitcoin and Tether. Tether is normally at a lower spread. I don't. We can talk about this more, but I, practically speaking, most Chinese people are buying Tether. I think that's actually kind of a mistake. But that's just my personal opinion. But it is a way for them to get out of the system, regardless. There are people also using Bitcoin in the same way, or buying Bitcoin in the same way. And so,
I see the
namely, you
same thing.
go,
I was just recently in Argentina, and it's kind
yeah,
of the same thing there. Like, because they've had all their crazy monetary issues over the years, and
yeah,
the tether is becoming like a very common way of payment for people. And so, I kind of view just stable coins in general as sort of a way to, well, you have fiat currency and stable coins and then Bitcoin. And I sort of view stable coins as the way that these countries with even worse fiat currencies than the US can sort of just plug
yeah.
into the US dollar, basically, which is better relatively. And I'm still trying to tell these people, like, you need to learn about Bitcoin now because it's actually going to be better than
Yeah.
all these things. Is that sort of your view as well?
Yeah, well, I'll tie together two questions you had because you had kind of talked a little bit about like what China is doing, and I think China is actually more pissed about Tether because look at what the state is doing. The state is trying to get away from U.S. Treasuries, and then Tether, as we know, backs its stable coins by buying U.S. Treasuries. And the way you redeem a token, and then they theoretically hold 1 to 1, and that 1 to 1 comprises a lot of I think 85% or 90% is treasuries at this point. There's some percent in Bitcoin, some percent in other assets. Um, so yeah, like I actually think China's pretty pissed about Tether because their people are just independently buying it. Like to your point, because they see the U.S. dollar as being superior to the yuan for a number of different reasons. And in China, what's kind of interesting is that, and this is why I think again the next billion. Why is that going to be China? And in China, the unique thing is that you're really fighting Tether. You're really fighting like USDT, and it's not because in other countries, Venezuela and Argentina, what you're really fighting against is like this narrative that the USDT, and China, right? Basically, what you're saying is like USDT is superior to your depreciating currency, which is something that people already get, right? Like a lot of the people in these countries already have a lot of US dollar demand because they're used to just dealing with like currencies that are going to zero like all the time, right? Like Turkey, Venezuela, Argentina. Argentina's just been through so many inflation episodes, right? So, but in China, which is kind of interesting, is that the demand is for a different reason. It's not necessarily that the yuan is depreciating in value like super quickly, although it is. The Chinese yuan is it's managed by the People's Bank of China, the Chinese central bank, to kind of float in a range according to the US dollar. So if you're buying the yuan, you already are kind of buying a weird kind of stable coin, if I want to think about it that way, compared to the US dollar. But the problem is, and the reason why people love USDT is because of those restrictions we talked about. Like the fact that you can't really transact with yuan. It's not the fact that it's depreciating in value and going to zero right away that scares people. It's more that once you have yuan, you're pretty much there's actually two versions of the yuan. There's like an overseas yuan and there's a domestic yuan. And once you're in a domestic yuan, you're pretty screwed. Like you can't really transfer it out of China. You can only invest in certain things, right? So I think like it in the next billion, if it's a narrative shift, I feel like just explaining to people, it because I find most Bitcoiners kind of anchor to the story of Argentina or Venezuela. It's like the easier story to tell. It's like, oh, your currency's inflating, like this and that. Like, so when I go on shows, like I've been on certain shows, the first question they always ask me is like, well, is the inflation out of control? And I'm kind of like, well, no, it's kind of the opposite problem, actually, to a certain degree, right? But the real problem they have is they don't control their own money. And so it's a very different kind of argument, if you understand what I'm saying. And then in so far, like Tether is also fighting with Bitcoin for that, but Chinese people are using more Tether to get out of that system. They're not necessarily leaving it because they think the yuan is going to go to zero. So it's a very different type of argument, right? And that's why I do think Chinese people kind of they rush towards like NFT, like layer two and that kind of stuff. I've also noticed that because they're really chasing like the ability to be able to invest in different things than the options they have, if that makes sense, um, versus hedging against like a massive inflation.
Yeah. Do you think that that's an education problem that people aren't, Chinese people aren't really really figuring out Bitcoin, or do you think that Tether just makes sense for their situation right now?
I think it's for a lot of different reasons. I mean, also Tether, the spread is just cheaper. So there's just some things with like just the mechanics of it. Like the way I don't even think I finished describing it, but basically there's like these OTC counters, right? And like they're basically informal merchants that are taking a risk. If they get arrested by the Chinese state, wherever they are, like they will get jail sentences handed to them for doing this, right? There's also maybe some people who are doing peer-to-peer trade, but that's like really hard to for us to really understand. Like I know anecdotally of some reports of that, but I suspect it's not like a huge amount of the volume. Like I suspect most of it's still going through like exchanges or OTC desks. Um, the thing with that is like if you're presented with an option and you're already like in the mindset of like going on an altcoin casino binge, like you're just gonna use Tether because the spread is lower, right? It's just plain and simple. Um, and so on a lot of these OTC desks that we're talking about, like Tether's just there's just many more people selling Tether than there are selling Bitcoin. And also from what I've heard is that people in like exporters and manufacturers will actually work with, like for example, in Africa, they'll ask for USDT. So if you're a Chinese exporter or a manufacturer, they'll actually ask them for USDT. And so that's actually happening at like quite large scale from my understanding. So there's a lot of USDT coming in as well to kind of like the Chinese economy. But I think it's two things. So, I talked to the very rare bunch of Bitcoin maxis in China and every once in a while, and it's a very frustrating experience for them. Because imagine, so even for us, like our little corner of the world, because I know you're on Nostr and everything like that, right? Like I would estimate that the people who care about NGU and are into crypto and altcoins, probably like 80% of people. And then we're probably like, I'll just say we, but like, let's say, just say Bitcoin maxis who are like, like are probably 20%, right? Maybe like, let's generously say that like 20% of the media ecosystem is about that, right? What I need people to understand is that in China, the ratio is more like 99.99999%. And then there's like three people who are like really into it. So like I was talking to someone who's like a Bitcoin maxi and he was like, yeah, they invite me to all these, there's like these like, I mean, there's not like super public events in China about quote unquote crypto. Like it's not a great idea given how the government's kind of acted. And actually, a while back, you had asked me if the government's going to acquire it, so we can kind of cover that as well. My short answer to that, by the way, is no, but we can elaborate on that later. But based on the way the government's reacting, not a great idea to openly advertise you're into crypto. Even the crypto meetups, like they don't really talk about Bitcoin, is a thing. So if you're like a Bitcoin maxi, there, it's like a very lonely experience. There are like a few, and they go on like there's two Mandarin language podcasts that are Bitcoin focused. Um, so always cool to see. And there's some NPubs that I always tell people. There's this one guy called ALE that I tell people to like follow. Like it's kind of cool. Like on some of the Nostr real, if you use like Amethyst or something with like auto translate, you can kind of get some of his posts. And that guy's like super into like Linux and Bitcoin, and it's super cool to see. But yeah, like I think it's partially like an educate like I don't know if that's I don't know if the culture stemmed because of education, but there's basically an imbalance between the ecosystems. Like the ecosystem in China is very different. And when the two encounter each other, that's where I find it really funny because people keep on telling me like I went to Bitcoin Asia and like everybody there is like a scammer, and I'm like, well, I don't know about that, but like I know the two conflict, and because you can see that live, you can see the 80-20 split versus the 99.99. I think in terms of the education element, It's there definitely could be more resources. I will say that in China, there's not necessarily like a ban, like kind of like what we were talking about. Like they're not going around and like seizing people's Bitcoin. They're also not necessarily going around and like, oh, you're looking to get educated about Bitcoin, like you're banned. Like there's like Bitcoin resources and stuff like Baike, which is kind of like a Chinese Wikipedia, has like a page on Bitcoin. It's not like super positive, but they have like information. There's information about Bitcoin around. They have like taken down quote unquote KOLs or influencers, but a lot of them for more like trading stuff. Like there are resources available, and I saw someone posted that they translated the the Bitcoin. It's like the Mi Premier Bitcoin's kind of like learning Bitcoin guide. They translate it into Mandarin. There's like a few GitHub repos up there. There are some developers that are in China, so that are working on Bitcoin, and they've been pretty public about that. Actually, they've been on like some podcasts and stuff like that. So I think there could always be more of that, but I also think that yeah, like a really big point of resistance is not just China. I think it's around the world. It's like you kind of have to slay like one dragon at a time. And the dragon that's the biggest right now is just the US dollar. And we live in an interesting world where the current US president believes that, Tether and crypto is actually strengthening the US dollar. And you can argue that maybe that's the case. And so, um, that's kind of like a hard battle because it's almost like psychologically ingrained. It might be more of a generational shift, to be honest with you, because I think like some older people, because I spent some time talking to like older people, older Chinese people, and they're so dollar oriented, because their lives have been constructed around the dollar, right? I suspect it's similar in like Argentina. I don't have as much experience, but countries that have been through that phase where China's growth all kind of happened in the last 30 years, and a lot of the older Chinese people are like used to a China or remember a China that used to be dirt poor, and where U.S. dollars used to be like at such a high premium, right? So I don't know. I don't know that there's like a way to educate against that. I think that some of it's generational and some of it's just being part of the culture and community and like accessing that and like empowering people who are already educating within the community. Kind of like I mentioned ALE and like a couple of other Bitcoin maxis that are in China already, like giving them the platforms and tools, whether it's this podcast or other podcasts. But I also think that some of it's just like pure mechanics. Like you have to, I mean, in this respect, I think the transaction fees being so low might help. Because essentially what you would want to do is like have the OTC desks offer a lower margin. Like mechanically speaking, the thing that you would want to do to win that argument is to have a lower spread on Bitcoin than Tether, which would mean like many more of these merchants providing Bitcoin versus Tether. Um, so how that happens is like I don't know. It's like some combination of like transaction fees being low, and also I know USDT is getting integrated with Lightning Network, so maybe more people are using Lightning as kind of like a way to transact in Tether even. But yeah, those are big questions, Ben, and those are kind of like my incomplete answers though.
Yeah. And like you said earlier, like the people there are really sort of wired for the NGU technology, and for the newer listeners, that stands for number go up.
Yeah.
And I mean, everyone seems like worldwide, that's sort of the first thing that we latch onto. And I've certainly heard that Asian countries very much, like whether it be Japan, Korea, China, like all of them do have more of that lean right now to the crypto altcoin sort of casino with all these numbers going all over the place. And so I suppose that that's what it'll take a lot of ways for Bitcoin for them to start, paying more attention. Unfortunately, it's less opportunity then when it's more expensive, but that's how it goes. And also just the jockeying of all the nation states is so interesting to me because
Hmm.
you would think when you look on paper, like for years before this, I've always thought, man, the USA, we have this global reserve currency. We have so much control because we have like the big mighty
So,
dollar that we just ship all over the place and everyone holds it. it seems like we would be the last ones to support Bitcoin or adopt Bitcoin, but that seems to sort of change in the last year or two. I mean, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. But I mean, Trump came to the Bitcoin conference last year. I went and listened to it and sort of fell asleep because he didn't know what he was talking about. But he has people around him that do. And, it's just, we saw the Bitcoin strategic reserve news coming out. And it seems like the USA is actually being quite friendly to Bitcoin, which is this thing that sort of uproots the whole global reserve currency status that we have. And like you said, they're talking about how they think some of this could be good for strengthening the U.S. dollar. I don't really see that. I feel like this is the ultimate Trojan horse of, just
Yeah.
sort of getting this thing in there that's going to blow the whole fiat system up. And what are your thoughts on just that in general, and this game being played between Bitcoin sort of lurking in the background with all these countries that are deciding what to do with it, but it's going to come in eventually and be a huge part of this?
Yeah. No, lots of different questions there. I did want to kind of, because I know originally we want to talk about CBDC, so I do want to also
We go
just,
all over the place here. It's hard to keep on
yeah, it's all
track. We'll
good.
get to
It's all
that
good.
eventually.
But I did want to point out that CBDCs do have a place to play in this conversation because, for example, China has been using the digital yuan, small steps, but they've used it to buy oil from the United Arab Emirates. And so when we talk about central bank digital currency, there are these geopolitical implications. So when you're talking about these countries jockeying about different currencies, like that is one place central bank digital currencies play into. But yeah, the whole look, I'm not as I watch American politics or American politics or American geopolitics as much as the next person, I guess. Like, like some people who are more avid than I am, maybe, might be even more deeper into the trenches on that. Where I kind of sit, because I have a really laser beam focus on like Tether and on Bitcoin and the geopolitical adoption of Bitcoin and things like that. Um, so the first thing is that it seems that in this new monetary order, the United States is trying to embrace stablecoins, and the idea is that you saw Trump come out and say, like, we're not going to do a central bank digital currency, but Congress is trying to regulate who can issue stable coins. And so ultimately, they are trying to control, the providers being either Circle or Tether. Like, if you look at the bill, it's essentially trying to favor those two companies and trying to disfavor other new entrants, whoever they might be, right? So, for example, Binance has issued like a U.S. backed stablecoin. I'm not sure that the U.S. authorities love that because, of course, CZ had to, go through his whole travails there. Look, so China's, not China. So the States, has been trying to kind of play this game where I think it and other countries in its periphery, including Canada, have realized that central bank digital currencies are like super unpopular, just super, super unpopular across the board. Um, and there's probably not a way to get that through Congress or in other countries' parliament, for example. And so if you can't have a central bank digital currency, what can you have that might be similar? And a stable coin that will freeze funds when you ask it to. For example, Tether is cooperative with the Department of Justice. You saw the whole Bybit thing, and they froze a whole bunch of different addresses. Apparently, the Houthis have been transacting in Tether, and so those addresses have been added to the OFAC blacklist and all this other stuff. So, like I've always argued, and this is maybe not so popular, I think, with some people, but I've always argued that I think stablecoins are essentially a proxy CBDC because they basically are. It's a company, right? I mean, it goes against the whole Bitcoin ethos. It's just like it's a platform over a protocol, and it's a platform with like an identifiable human CEO, of which you can put a lot of pressure on. Like, no offense even to like Pablo or anyone who like runs these companies. Like, I'm sure they're great people. It's the fact that they are people. It's always an issue. I talk. like I don't have an issue with them personally. It just even just like the fact that you need to have a person that already is a problem, right? And so I think stable coins are a way for people to like to countries to kind of like create digital money. And then for people, they're like, it's kind of like Facebook. I use this example because Facebook came out and there used to be a private CIA project that was very similar to Facebook. Because essentially, Facebook accomplishes something that intelligence agencies love, which is like it just gives more information about how people are connected to each other. Um, so the CIA used to have this project called LifeLogger, but you would never have 1 billion people sign up or 2 billion people sign up for like Project LifeLogger from the CIA. It's like what? But if you had this cool, snazzy product, like, oh, Silicon Valley, Facebook, so cool, so many features that you can use and stuff like that, good. Most people want to adopt that, sadly, I think. But, a lot of people take that trade off. And I think it's going to be the same thing with stable coins, right? It's like they're already tapping into the fact that so many people, for different reasons, like Argentina or anywhere else, like that they want access to US dollars, but they don't want the clunkiness and the KYC that comes with US dollar banking, right? So Tether is kind of like a compromise for that because you're not going to get those people anyways because those people are not acceptable by the US dollar banking system, right? Worst, best comes to best, you can regulate them through the US foreign correspondent banking system, which is that anytime someone wants a US dollar, the US bank has to interface with a foreign bank, and that US bank and typically even that foreign bank are usually regulated, right? So anytime someone wants US dollars, what's called the euro dollar, right? In a banking account, they have to interface with US regulators indirectly, at least. But Tether and stablecoins like that kind of create this cool hip, like, oh, you don't have to wire people, you don't have to, like it doesn't take 40 hours, like you don't have to have like a domestic banking account even, So I've heard all kinds of like honestly kind of badass use cases, like for example, Iranians who use it instead of a bank account, like they basically set themselves up as freelancers and they just use USDT to avoid both the Iranian and the US banking systems because both banking systems would try to screw them, you know? But the thing with that is that Tether, by at the end of the day, it is controllable, and you need to trust the company that is now buying and gobbling up U.S. treasuries and is more and more beholden to U.S. politics. And one thing I think that has gone undernoticed is like the Tether's primary custodian of their treasuries is now the Secretary of Commerce, right? And so you're seeing this like interplay come up where the US government is now pretty enmeshed and has made money off of, Tether. And so has a lot of incentives to keep that going and to keep that relationship going. Now, when you talk about Bitcoin, I think this is kind of like my more pessimistic side, but I think that the US and Hong Kong are trying to do the same thing with Bitcoin. They're trying to make it into ETF coin, right? So I see the bear case for Bitcoin being like email. And the reason why I mention that is email, I've always mentioned this to people. And there's differences, of course, because email is used to just transmit bits and bytes of information. Sometimes you can argue financial value, but of course, Bitcoin, every time you send a transaction, you are sending financial value, you are sending money. But email, it used to be the case that you had to set up your own email servers in order to do email. And a lot of the cypherpunks that, kind of came out, the privacy preserving punks that, kind of built the ethos of Bitcoin and so a lot of the initial technology for it, they came about because they wanted to make email more private. There were these things called remailers, right? And the whole idea was that you could send email, but nobody could understand where that email is coming from. But basically, it was kind of like Bitcoin in its setup. Like people were running their own servers, and they were like very conscious of their privacy and things like that. But lo and behold, what ended up happening? Well, you had companies like Google that built these really easy to access platforms because people wanted access to email. They wanted access to the ability to send and receive an email. And Google made it a lot easier to do that. and also added a whole bunch of features to it, right? And so I worry that that's going to happen with Bitcoin because the vast majority, and you're seeing some of that a little bit already, I think, because you're looking at a world where there's like quote unquote so much demand for Bitcoin, but then also the mempool, which is where, self custodian, usage and where, true sovereign usage of Bitcoin happens has never been lower. Like, I mean, there's like empty blocks. Like, basically, Bitcoin has, there doesn't seem like people are actually using the Bitcoin network as we're speaking, right? So that's kind of like my fear is that Bitcoin kind of becomes this like financial toy that pumps the bags of like ETF issuers, who can charge management fees for people to kind of, Hong Kong and kind of did the same thing. And the States, it's obviously been the most successful ETF launch, right? I want to say that's also been good for Bitcoin for different reasons. I mean, Bitcoin doesn't work unless the price goes up, ultimately, right? So I know we spend a lot of time. I myself personally, my point of view, like the NGU people, it's like like, but NGU plays a role in Bitcoin, just like what you alluded to, right? Like, I mean, we obviously also wouldn't be here if Bitcoin was still like $1 or something, right? Obviously, the ecosystem would not be as strong as it was before, but it does, similar to Gmail, the trade-offs are hard to discern, and ultimately, you realize like, hey, you had this route to do sovereign communications or just to do sovereign finance, but instead you let companies like Coinbase or whatever take it over and then give you like loan backed, Bitcoin or whatever assets they want to add on there, right? So to me, that's kind of like, I think the United States government is making a bet, and they're not entirely incorrect, that they can corral the effects of Bitcoin and treat Bitcoin kind of like a financial asset that, in a respect, is hedging them against themselves, because the U.S. dollar inflation is kind of the main reason why Bitcoin's price is probably going up. So there's that, but also I think through like a mechanism of control. Like, I think the bet is that, I think where I spend a lot of time thinking about it is like, how do you advance sovereign usage of Bitcoin? That's a very hard question. I'm not super qualified to answer it by myself, but that is where the space is, and that's where I think countries think they can kind of have one over on Bitcoin, so they can have their cake and eat it too. They can have Bitcoin and stable coins, and it somehow strengthens the U.S. dollar.
Yeah, so many interesting points to touch on there. I mean, that conversation of just, you brought up the empty blocks, and I know that Jack Dorsey has said in the past, like the biggest threat to Bitcoin is people just, losing interest. Personally, I've never worried about this. I just feel like we're
Mm,
at the point in game theory now where we do have these sort of blocks of time where everyone's distracted by something happening over here because
yeah,
there's so much chaos happening in the world and people don't have the educational foundation to connect the dots to Bitcoin being the solution to these problems yet.
yeah,
But I just see lots more people, creating content, writing books, making podcasts, getting their word out, writing articles like you on Forbes, getting onto these big platforms, and just continuing to nudge people in the right direction. And it's funny. So I live here in a house right now with. I'm in Costa Rica with a bunch of people from the Primal team, the
oh,
Nostr
awesome,
client. And so one of the guys, Paul Keating, who I've had on the podcast a couple of times, me and him get into little squabbles over the medium of exchange versus the store of value sort of track for Bitcoin. And just
yeah,
as a little summary for people, he's 100% on a Bitcoin standard. He does 100% Bitcoin. He buys everything with Bitcoin. He's paid in Bitcoin like it's his whole life. So he's 100% there, which is awesome. I'm not quite there yet personally, and I'm not super stressed about it because I just see Bitcoin as like the ultimate savings account right now.
mm,
And I always sort of point people toward Vijay Boyapati's article, The Bullish Case for Bitcoin, which sort of talks about these cycles that you go through, the different phases where you start out as a store of value, where, using gold as the example from way in the
mm,
past, when people saw this cool shiny rock on the ground, they just started picking it up and hoarding it. And then as more and more people decide, oh, we should use this to transact as a money, then all of a sudden it changed into a medium of exchange later once people had already hoarded it. So I'm kind of in the camp of like, we don't need to force anything, just continue
Mm.
educating on, why fiat currency is a problem. And I also would say I completely agree with you that stable coins are really just in the same category as CBDCs. It's these controlled monies that have a head of the snake.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that this is the solution here. We're trying to get away from all the fiats, and those are, they're just fiat by nature. And maybe we could use this to sort of pivot into CBDCs from a total beginner 101. We talked about it a little bit here. It stands for central bank digital currencies.
Yeah.
And I'm sure a lot of people listening maybe have not heard of this before. So could you explain what are CBDCs, also known as central bank digital currencies?
Yeah, sure. So central bank digital currencies are digital currencies issued by the central bank. No, sometimes the quiz answer is right in the question. But no, I mean, you might think your viewers might listen to this and be like, well, how's that like different, or how's that different from what currently happens in the economy? And I think that's where we talk a little bit. Let's use the United States as an example. So right now, if you have a bank account, right, and you have money, technically you are working with what's called the commercial banking system, right? You're not actually interfacing directly with the central bank. Like, i.e., whenever you hear about the central bank is printing money, which you could go into the mechanics of, and that would be another 2 hours. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the central bank is not directly interfacing with you. Like, it's not the one. So when you see like $3,000 in your, I don't know, Wells Fargo account, that is not like the central bank is interfacing with Wells Fargo to say that like Wells Fargo holds certain amounts of that in a reserve, right? So now central bank digital currencies actually flip that relationship on its head. It allows the central bank to directly issue you digital forms of currency in a way that in the United States is also going to be additionally revolutionary, because what we've seen in other countries. So in other countries, just for some context, like China, for example, there's been a lot of movement from cash to mobile payments. So they kind of they leapfrogged a generation of payment tech, namely that a lot of Chinese people use mobile phones for payments. Like they directly use kind of WeChat Pay or Alipay, right? So in the States right now, a lot of payment is still effectuated through cards. And now it's like you kind of integrate it with Apple Pay. So you're using cards, but you're using them on your phone, which is kind of like an ironic kind of thing. In a central bank digital currency world, you're looking to see apps that are kind of controlled and maintained by the central bank, sometimes provided through commercial banking partners. But these apps allow you to directly scan, people to pay them directly or to receive funds with your own QR code, right? And those funds tend to be held directly by the central bank. So what does that really mean? Well, that means unlike commercial banks, so a commercial bank can't create money per se. What it can do is if you deposit your money in a commercial bank, it can lend out some amount more than the money that you put in. That's what we call fractional reserve, right? That's its own wormhole. But in interfacing directly with the central bank, there's two things. One is that they have access to how you're using the thing. And two, they can actually issue you money directly, because a central bank digital currency is a direct liability of the central bank. Now that sounds like gobbledygook, but what that really means is that the central bank actually is directly in a relationship with you, which is a very new thing. And to tangibly bring why that could be dangerous, for example, is the Chinese central bank. They did this pilot of the CBDC and they made the funds expirable. So they said, we are going to give you 200 USD equivalent, but you need to spend this in 2 weeks or else you don't have that money. And, what's funny is I've been looking a lot at the CBDC tracker by HRF, Human Rights Foundation, which I recommend for people who are kind of looking at it. One of the things about the central bank digital currency debate, which I find really unfortunate, is that most people are super pro CBDC, like most academics. And so it's very hard to find resources, authoritative resources that are kind of, we're almost like, I think me and like a couple of other people were like the anti-canon. We're like probably like the only ones that are out there, right? But anyways, HRF is actually also one of those sources, and I find that obviously they're if you want like a fair and balanced view, you might look at the CBDC tracker of like the Atlantic Council and then the HRF. But if you want the my perspective or what I believe to be the truth, CBDCs are bad. Woo. HRF has a really good tracker summarizing that. And what I found really interesting is that each case of programmable money has a dystopian use case, like specific to the context of each country. So to give you a quick example, I was just reading this. South Korea is releasing a CBDC, and they were saying like, oh, well, with this new capability, um, you know, uh, like parents can actually like dictate their children's money. So if their children are failing at school, they can like program the money so that like the kids can't spend it on like chocolate or something. I don't know. And I'm like,
Without mentioning that they can also then control the parents' money.
yeah,
it's,
exactly. Like
who's
they could do the
working up
same
to the
thing. It's
actual
like,
banks are
well,
actually in control here.
yeah, exactly. It's like, well, okay, well, you're just telling me there's a parental control system. Okay, cool. But then isn't that just like a human control system?
The central banks are the parents of the parents.
Yeah, exactly. Like who watches the watchers? Well, I mean, the central bank does. So, you know, so yeah, that's kind of like the central bank digital currency in a nutshell, at least the retail side. And I guess another thing that we kind of briefly covered on is like it has this role to play in the new monetary order because up to now, Ben, as you've said, like most of the time when countries are transacting with one another for commodities, they're actually using the US dollar. That's one of the reasons why the United States is the dominant superpower in the world. But increasingly, there have been experiments and attempts to use other forms, and namely, for example, the digital yuan in China, which I think is the world's most advanced central bank digital currency, has been used to settle payments. And I know that there's been some reporting on how Russia and China, assumably, they're going to settle this with CBDCs to a certain extent, but that they've been using alternatives to the US dollar as well. Um, and so the BRICS countries per se, per large, I think, have been trying to hedge against the US dollar.
Yeah, so I think a good line that you just put out there that basically sums it up is that CBDCs just give the central banks a direct relationship with you. It cuts out those commercial banks in the middle, and so you are directly just holding a currency created by the central bank. And I think that the majority of average people on the street that aren't in these rabbit holes with us would hear that and they would just think, I mean, whatever. Like I already have my money at the bank, so how does this really change anything for me?
Yeah.
Uh, and us Bitcoiners explain to them, and you can elaborate on this, how this basically the commercial banks. Actually, I'd be curious of hearing your thoughts on this because commercial banks do have the power to turn off your accounts and shut off your money, but
But they have to
CBDC or the
return the
central
money
banks
back.
have even more power, basically, to just dictate what you can and can't buy. Like they can insert rules into the money where you can only spend a certain amount this day. You can't
Right.
buy certain
Right.
things. If
Right.
you get in
But
trouble
but
with the
but
law,
a
it
but
cuts you off.
a but a you can choose many different commercial banks, so you
True.
can choose different options. And B, in the event that they debank you, they do actually have to return your funds to you. Like they don't, you know what I'm saying? Like they do. Like in the case of like legitimately in the CBDC case, we've seen instances. I mean, they did it where they airdropped the funds, so you can argue that like that was just money that was created, but they expired funds. Like they didn't give the money back. Like they literally said, you cannot spend this amount. That's not a thing a commercial bank can do. Like legally speaking, they can't actually do that.
And this would be an interesting to talk about too, because so
Yeah.
clearly it just gives the banks more control over people's ability to transact, which we do not want.
Yeah.
We have enough rules being placed on people, and we are trying to go the opposite direction with Bitcoin, where anyone can transact with anybody. This is
Yeah.
the clearly better option. But we know that these central banks have a lot of power, and they're definitely going to want to incentivize people to use their
Yeah.
coin instead of Bitcoin. And so, what are the different incentives, like the carrots that they're dangling in front of people that you've seen already happen in these countries that have adopted it? And which
Yeah.
ones do you think will come up in the future as ways that they try to pull the sheep into their herd.
Yeah, no, definitely happy to talk about that. But first, let me also be really clear. I'm not a big fan of the commercial banking system. I was just trying to point out that like central banking, commercial banking is different. If it's me, I think you should also get your money out of the commercial banking system. But that's just my opinion.
We don't
Um,
like any banks here.
we
They're
don't
all
like any
different levels of
banks,
bad.
but especially not the central bank. Like, it's like the villain tier two. Um, but yeah, no, so governments has been really interesting because some governments have played it kind of like even China has kind of been like, well, we're not trying to replace cash, and like you see the European Central Bank kind of say the same thing. It's like, oh, well, we're not trying to replace cash. We're like, we're just trying to do our own thing, and like, people want it, people want it. Actually, the only country that's been really honest about it is Nigeria, which I find really interesting. Nigeria's just been like, no, we want 100% cashless society, and there's been like riots and stuff because they've like really tried to enforce it. But anyways, so you see these people kind of saying that, but they obviously the tape tells a different tale. And one example, this is for example, in the EU, there are increasingly member states that have restricted your cash usage. So there's actually like literal physical, I think Greece, for example, and like a couple of other countries in the EU have placed restrictions on cash. So there's kind of two things happening. One is cash is just dying out. Sad for me to say, I think. I actually, honestly, pretty big cash fan myself, but that it does seem to be the case that less and less people are using cash, and more people are using digital payments. And then I think the governments of the world are trying also to incentivize and push their own version of digital cash over and above private solutions. Because in a lot of these different countries, including in China, it's actually private solutions that have actually won out. So for WeChat Pay or Alipay. The Chinese government has tried numerous carrots. Kind of like what I alluded to before, it did an airdrop of sorts. So it basically just texted people, and because it's the government and they're able to like access or work with other governments, they actually just texted people and said, you have free money. So it's a pretty,
Yay! What could go wrong? This is
yeah,
great.
yeah. What could go wrong? I mean, that money can be seized from you right away, and it's tracked all the time. But also, I mean, because you're the government, you can do that, right? It's like I almost laughed because I'm like, oh, they're like the world's most powerful airdropper. Because like all these other coins or tokens have to like collect people's texts and emails manually, but you could just use the emergency broadcast system to like, hey, here's my coin. Anyways, so yeah,
And
so
we've
there's
seen with
that.
stimulus checks, like during COVID, the stimulus checks was kind of the last time people have seen something like this, where the government comes out and says, "Great news, everybody! You're getting free money," and they
Yeah,
don't talk about any of the downstream consequences. Which it's so sad how the vast majority of people can't think further than one step ahead. Where
yeah,
they print money to give you money, and that just increases inflation, which just makes the problem worse later. And no
yeah.
one gets
I
this.
I mean, it's and you see this around the world, but like the short termism, right? It's like as brought to you by the current political administration. So you also have that in China. Um, the Also the Chinese party state. One thing that they've been doing with the digital payments, which is kind of an interesting point of contention, is they usually make the transaction fees super low. So in China, or super low to zero. So China, for example, like it doesn't cost you anything if you're paying someone, but for merchants, they have like an acceptance fee, because because private platforms they have to make money, right, in order to exist. So they take that money from the the merchant. So typically, for example, like uh, hopefully, I think your viewers might know this, but like if you go to a shop and you use a credit card, you like the shop has to pay a fee for you using that. It's called an interchange fee. It's basically kind of like a discovery fee. It's like, oh yeah, like you helped this person make a payment, and so therefore and it's actually decently steep. It's like 2.75 or 3% on average or something like that. So the governments that have rolled out CBDCs like China, they've tried to make it a 0% transaction fee. And there was actually kind of an interesting argument I heard in a podcast where it's like that makes it good for like agent to agent agentic payments, like if you're thinking about like AI and stuff like that. Because in theory, like it basically removes like any of the friction for microtransactions. So since you're the government, again, you can actually just do that. You can just be like, we don't need to make profit because we just issue you know, we just issue money whenever we want. Um, so there doesn't need to be transaction fees. But of course, that also like collapses, like to your long-term consequences, it collapses like private markets for for payment fees and transactions. It would, except that the CBDC is incredibly unpopular in China, which is also another thing to talk about, which is like there hasn't been that much adoption. In fact, last time I took a look, I think I was looking at like Pierre Richard was posting something, and basically I drew the conclusion. I don't remember the exact numbers offhand, but I drew the conclusion that Bitcoin now does 5 times the amount of volume the Chinese yuan has ever done in like 1 quarter.
Wow.
Yeah, like just it's off the chart. Even though we're talking about the fact that the mempool is like pretty empty, like we just have to remember that Bitcoin is still ticking along as we're going. Like I'm still
It's
very
always
optimistic. By the
lurking.
way, I've seen
It's
bearish,
just
but like I am very optimistic on Bitcoin for like
yeah.
just kind of like what you mentioned, Ben. Like we're creating, we're educating, we're doing all these other things. So that's kind of like my bull case. But yeah, like CBDCs are being are coming in through these kind of incentives, and then also the Chinese party state has like pretty much used the levers it can use, right? Like so, state media talks it up, and also other kind of like they pretty much force. So where China's failed in the CBDC is actually the long tail of merchant adoption. So in China, increasingly people don't actually accept cash, and what they do is they put like a WeChat code or like whatever, or like an Alipay code, and you scan the code and you pay them directly with your cell phone. So this is like even like a mom and pop like convenience store you can think of, or like whatever, or like a little hole in the wall restaurant, or like a street food stall. Like they'll have that set up. And the thing is, the Chinese government, as a carrot, can force all the major aggregators. So imagine the states. I imagine the rollout in the states might be quite similar, actually. Like the if the states had also some mobile payment solution that had a lot of traction. But let's just say the U.S. government was trying to compete with Mastercard because it'll make you because I was about to like spit out a whole bunch of Chinese names, but like your viewers would be like, what? But okay, so let's say they're doing that, right? So what the U.S. government could do is they could go to like, what's like a good, like they could go to Airbnb and they can go to Uber. They can go to like the big platforms, the big tech companies, and they're like, hey, you need to accept e-dollars from now on, like no matter what. They can go to like Apple. They can be like, Apple Pay needs to have an option that has e-dollars also, like an e-dollar account. That's basically what China's government's done, right? But what they haven't been able to do is they haven't been able to force like Joe Schmo, who's running like a food truck in downtown Austin, just like a random example, to like embrace e-dollars, if that makes sense. And that's in China, at least. That's where the most of the merchant adoption is. That's like where most of the ecosystem is when it comes to digital payments. Like the long tail is quite long in China. So yeah, those are some of the carrots that the Chinese state has kind of put in. Were you going to ask me about the sticks, or?
I mean, we could talk about that too, I guess. I mean, that's the natural next step is for the people, like you said. I mean, just to quickly just talk about how you mentioned that the state media is talking it up like crazy and they're really pushing hard on it, but it seems like the adoption is pretty low.
Yeah.
And I from what I've heard from people who have traveled to China, I briefly went to China myself, very briefly, so I didn't really get to check it all out and really get to know the people there. But it seems like they're pretty based. They know what's going on, and they know that
Yeah.
the authority for, or the trust for authority is quite low. I just saw an Instagram reel this morning of a bunch of Chinese people, like whole towns are painting their roofs blue because they've seen what's happening in Maui and LA. Like they're paying attention to stuff, and so they know. It's easy for us in the U.S. to sort of look at China and think, oh, like, it's total communism. Everyone's a robot. But the people, I think, actually know what's going on. We just don't really hear their side of the story because they can't be too loud, or then they will get in trouble, right?
Yeah, it's also like a really weird thing where like Chinese, like the typical trope is like you can see like a million videos of these like old Chinese men like yelling at police and just being like, "Get the fuck out of my store!" Like, "Fuck you," and you would think like in the States like that would never happen. Like it's like, but it's like a weird thing. It's like, you don't want to like go out in public and start yelling like down with the Chinese Communist Party, but if you yell at the cops or something, they're like, they're actually quite shy about that kind of
It
stuff.
seems like Asian cultures, from my observations, have a deeper connection to that honor. And like it's been, closer in
Yeah.
their history that they have like a huge sense of honor where like if you're being disrespected, you say no, fuck you. Like
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and like I can't. Well, the other thing too is like I feel like Chinese people are this is like a general steer, and again, like I go back to my whole like I'm not trying to represent 1.4 billion people, but now I am. But like yeah, it's like generally a very unruly bunch. Like even the Chinese internet, you kind of like to your point, like people I think have this vision of like how it's like the Soviet Union or something. It's like just gruel. And honestly, the Chinese internet is just like a kind of weird version of like the Western internet. Plus or minus, you can't talk about a whole bunch of things, but like I'm able to see really important things too. But like one thing about the Chinese internet is like they're super sarcastic. And I've also found this in the Iranian internet as well. Like there's these like people who use the internet like chronically, like Iran and China. Like Chinese people also use the internet like chronically. And yeah, they just like form their own conclusions, and they might not be able to like openly talk about it, but if you can like read between the lines, you can see some pretty funny stuff. Like there's so Mao Zedong's eldest son died because in the Korean War, and the story goes that um it's because he was cooking fried rice or a certain type of fried rice, and so on the date where he died, it's like sensitive to like post that, right? But you'll see like people like on the Chinese internet, they're like, "What the fuck? You can't post like fried rice anymore? Like what is this bullshit?" Like it's like it's not as like the sterile like everybody submits the state kind of thing. So I mean that also gives me some hope too. Like I think people aren't as robotic as you would assume, I guess.
yeah, and there's flavors of this happening in every single country that we in the West sort of view as
Yeah.
the media just tells us it's these crazy, like awful dictatorships where, they're being terrible with their people and the people are all zombies. And like another one that, we're constantly told is like our terrible, horrible enemy in America is Russia. Like Russia's so
Yeah.
bad and, Putin's the most evil person ever. And, I talk with Russians all the time. I just hung out with some of them in Argentina. We went hiking on a mountain together and I sort of
Yeah.
just tapped into their brains on all this stuff. And they're like, oh yeah, like they have all these, the rules about websites you can't go to and content you can't see. And we just use VPNs.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. No, I mean Chinese people
same
same
thing. Like they're just
thing.
getting around it. Like they don't actually respect those things.
Yeah, Chinese people is the same thing, and it's Chinese people. I mean, it's an obvious point, but like I never hesitate to make it. Like the people aren't the government, right? And in effect, like the governments of the world are just trying to divide us, right? But like when you sit down and you talk with people across, you realize that you both hate the government equally, for like different reasons, though. That's my stance, at least for the people I talk to. But like, I mean, you know, um, Chinese people are like perfectly capable of like making their own independent opinions as well. Like it's and yeah, like a lot of people, and they're almost like I want to say that a lot of the Chinese people I've seen, even on Nostr, for example, like they're just like so used to it. I always call it like a rose that grow out of concrete. It's like always cool to see because it's like when you live in that kind of a the somewhat of a repressive setting, like you have to come around with like some ways around it, right? It kind of becomes like a default in your life. And it's not like a huge like it's kind of like to your point. It's not like oh my god, I have to struggle like this internal struggle. No, it's just like find a good VPN provider. That can be kind of annoying though, by the way. But like it at the end of the day, that's kind of what it is. Um, but like to live your life that way is like already kind of like a little bit different. You know what I'm saying? Like as opposed to it gives you like a different source of like one thing I always tell people is like one of the reasons why Nostr actually could work out well for Chinese people and why it seemed to have gone well for a certain point in time. I saw you had Will Kasserin on the show. So like yeah, like Damas for example, like surged in Hong Kong and China for a bit, and part of the reason why is just because like VPNs are like kind of really annoying to deal with, um, and it's not like I mean it's not like anything is an absolute ban. like you'll if you just go around, you'll see like people talking in Mandarin on X or Twitter, and like people who it's called flipping the Great Firewall. You'll see that around like everywhere, kind of thing. But you start to realize that they just have like a different mentality because of like the constraints that have been placed on them. And one of them is just like the VPNs are just super annoying to deal with. Like it's not like existential. Like you're not going to necessarily go to. I mean, you might get fined or something, but like that would be like it'd be like back in the day if you were smoking weed in Portland and you were the one person who was like caught for doing that, right? Like that's kind of like what VPNs are in China. So if you're that one unlucky person, maybe, but otherwise it's just like super slow and super annoying to deal with. But you don't get to know these things unless you like actually talk to the people. Like I actually talked to a few people on Nostr. I'm like, why do you use Nostr? And they were like, oh yeah, because it's like this place doesn't take my phone number, which is tracked my ID, and it's like pretty quick. Because if I use like a VPN, it's going to be like super slow to load stuff, and I find that super annoying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. And I'd love to really dive into the Nostr side too. That's another big topic I want to talk about. But real quick, are you good on time? I know our
Yeah, I'm
original.
good. I'm good on time. Good on time. I
Okay,
think I'm good for
awesome. So
another, like 30 minutes. Yeah.
with all of that sort of in mind now that we this hopeful side of things, I agree that a lot of people, like human beings, are natural problem solvers. Like when they're given stupid rules, a lot of them do disobey, and it's sometimes doesn't feel
Mm.
that way when we see all the people around us in our own lives are sort of just following along these NPC zombie paths. But more and more people are disrespecting authority, which is a good thing.
Mm.
They're asking their own questions. They're finding solutions that work for them as technology is giving us these solutions. So that sort of brings us back to what we were going to answer earlier, which is the stick.
Yeah.
So the CBDCs are going to try to dangle the carrot. If that doesn't work, what are the stick solutions that you see happening that people need to watch out for?
Yeah. I mean, surprisingly, like I mentioned, Nigeria was kind of like the the one country that's been seemingly trying to enforce the stick as much. Like other countries have not been as much putting sticks, but yeah, I mean the ultimate stick is they're just like you can't use cash, right? Like we're going to refuse to. I mean in India that's what happened with demonetization. Like they just basically said if you hold these banknotes, like we're just going to refuse to acknowledge them as legal tender. Because of course the government always has the power, reserves the power to always do that if it wants to, right? So that's the ultimate stake. The ultimate stake is like a country, like for example, Nigeria, which has been quite clear about saying like we want our society to be 100% cashless. They can just ultimately decide like cash is no longer a thing, right? That would be the ultimate stick. And then it's up to you. Like for your economic survival, you basically have to churn all your cash into something, right? Whether that's gold or CBDC or something. But that is the ultimate stick. I think that there are reasons for why a government would not want to do that. And certainly, I think in China and in Europe, they've been at pains to say they will not do that because I do think that if they did actually ever do that, that would have massive economic consequences. Um, even though China's been the most aggressive at the CBDC, they've been more focused on like the carrots. I mean, the stick that they can offer is for companies, right? Like any company that's a centralizing choke point, kind of like what I mentioned. I think it's pretty much implied that like if you don't put in the ECNY, like for example during the Olympics, it was one of the three payment options, even though Visa was like the exclusive sponsor or whatever. Like I'm pretty sure it's implied that like if you don't obey what we're doing, if you're a company, we're gonna like fuck you up. Like so I think that's kind of like the stick that they offer for companies. But for individuals, it's a little bit yeah, like because you can't like imagine a world where you arrested everyone for using cash, for example, which is kind of close to the world that Nigeria is trying to go down. Like, it'd be pretty insane. I don't think even like the most dystopian government would try to do it in that way. Do you know what I'm saying? So the stick part, less so, I hope. But one thing I will say is that since central banks have been so bad at doing this, and one of the reasons why I mention this, like when I give talks, is like you've essentially made a central bank. So a central bank is used to regulating by telling other banks what to do. Like it's basically used to saying like, for example, like our target interest rate is 2.75% and 2.25%, right? The window corridor. I don't want to go into like all of monetary policy, but we could some other time. But essentially, the central bank like spits out numbers, and the market kind of obeys those numbers, whether in its role as like a regulator or whether its role, you know, in buying or selling different assets or whatever facilities it has control over, right? But a central bank digital currency does a very interesting thing. It actually makes them into tech companies. So what you see is like even in China, there's like a separate branch of the government of the central bank, like its own digital currency research institute that kind of spins off and selects vendors and thinks about adoption. Because the thing is like that's actually a very difficult. Essentially, the Chinese central bank is competing against WeChat and Tencent and Alibaba, which are these like very large tech companies, right? And like structurally speaking, there's like not really a way for them to do that. And I think that's why you're seeing like failure points everywhere. Like the head of the ECNY previously, the previous head of the Digital Currency Research Institute was actually arrested for bribery because he was taking mad amounts of bribes in order to choose all the vendors. So it's like a very weird thing because like you're basically asking the central bank to do something that's way outside its wheelhouse. And my fear is that in Nigeria, as in other countries are probably slowly going to realize that the stick is probably the only way they can really get this through. Like they think that the carrot's going to work, but so far as we've seen with the numbers, like that hasn't really panned out. And Nigeria, this is like very dystopian. They were kind of like, this whole I don't actually know as much about the details. Like normally I speak on panels with Charlene. She has a book out called The Bitcoin Leap. I think that probably explains Nigeria a little bit more because she's focused a lot of her research in Nigeria. My really 100,000 foot view of it is that Nigeria has been trying to make society more cashless, and there have been riots as a result. And then the central bank governor goes out and says, well, good news, everyone. We've gone from 0.5% usage of the central bank digital currency to 6% usage, right? So I think even though that's not going to be a great solution, I fear that central banks more and more are going to realize that like probably the stick is the only way to get that through. Or in the case of what the Western bloc is doing, like the United States and Canada, which I think is actually smarter, is to like have it like you already have a company that's figured out the technology part and that has a certain brand that isn't associated necessarily with the government directly. So just lean on them to do everything you want to do, like stable coins. And so the sticks they have are deployed towards the platform owners and things like that. But my fear is that if some of the central banks, I mean, like in countries like India where there's already been demonetization, I think you might see some central banks trying to jump the gun on cash, and that will create very radical consequences for the poor, which is who the central banks assumably think they care about or whatever. But like, you have all these poor people with like cash and they're just trying to, survive and live. And then all of a sudden their cash is worth zero. That's what happened in India. It's probably going to happen again, in other countries, including India. And the other thing that's really frustrating about this whole thing is like cash is like the weirdest target because a lot of the even like in India they tried to demonetize because they were trying to go after like quote unquote black market people, but those people had already put all their funds in gold. So really, what they ended up doing is just screwing a whole bunch of poor Indian entrepreneurs and like people who were just like struggling to make a living, right? And basically told them like you have however much time, I don't remember how much, maybe it's a month or something. You can fact check me on that, but you have a limited window of time where you have to come in and take all your life savings and just like convert it. Otherwise, that is going to be worth nothing at the end of the day. So yeah, I definitely think we haven't seen as many sticks, but the sticks can be quite dramatic.
Yeah, and to me, the way that I view the sticks is just that I have hope that enough people out there, that the majority or even the intransigent minority that's sort of sleeping under the surface, it has had enough seeds planted about Bitcoin and the problem with the banks and the government control and all this stuff and how the state is just too powerful right now, that if these sticks are to come out and start swinging, a lot of people will finally hit that final level of, okay, like this is why Bitcoin was actually made, is why I need Bitcoin. and they'll
Yeah.
finally jump into it head first. And because there's so many people out there who don't just get naturally drawn to it for these nerdy reasons like us of the number go up in Austrian economics and finding the Bitcoin standard. Most people will need something bad to happen to their current
Mm.
way of life for them to really be forced into it, sadly. And we can all do our best to, educate more people to be early, but there will be a point where we're no longer in the super early phase and whips are cracking from the top down and people will be rushing into these new solutions. And that's when things are really going to get chaotic. At least
Yeah.
that's how I see it. I do think that at some point we're going to see some sort of crackdown because the fiat system has all the power right now, and they
Yeah.
are not going to go quietly into the night. They have been built in a way that suck up these types of people that just feel like they deserve everything. They want to control everything and everyone.
Yeah.
So I think they're really going to use every single tool they can on the way out, and it will get very ugly at some point. So do you have any predictions on how this transition will be now that we have, the fiat system, we have the CBDCs that they're
Hmm.
pushing, and we have the stable coins and the Bitcoin? There's so many pieces to this puzzle here, so many players to this game, which is why it's just this always fascinating topic to talk about with people, because
Yeah.
it's impossible to really fully comprehend how this is going to go down. What are your predictions for, we'll say, maybe the next 10 years? Like, how do you think things will actually unravel in your vision?
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm on this podcast, and I'm wearing. Your viewers might not even see this, but I'm wearing a Be the Change hat, and so obviously we know where I stand. So this is kind of like buyer beware with my views, but well, one thing I thought to start off with, one thing I thought was really interesting was when we were talking about Bitcoin and the United States embracing it. Um, the fact that El Salvador was punished by the IMF in order to get really favorable terms. And I think this is what when we're talking about the fiat system fighting with all the tools it has, the fiat system still has a lot of tools. And namely, for every government that kind of is out there, a lot of governments are struggling with debt. A lot of governments are struggling with the consequences of bad decisions over the last decades. And who is going to save them? Well, the US backed fiat system, right? So I think that there is going to be quite a struggle, and we should not underestimate ourselves as Bitcoiners, but we should also not underestimate the tools that are available to keep the current monetary system. Like the default, we have to be, or Bitcoiners have to be, like the extra level or the extra kind of layer up, because the default is inertia, and it's a very powerful inertia. And it's an inertia that's enforced by a lot of mechanisms and tools, which take honestly years to fully study up on. But the short of it is that there are a lot of these tools and facilities that keep the world the way it is right now. And the world, the way it is right now, is that people just trade in US dollars, and the US has the privilege of printing dollars whenever it wants. Right. So mm, that's one thing. I think the way it's going to play out is like, or the way it seems to be playing out right now, is there's some countries that are going to go the CBDC route. And I read about this in my book. You know, there there's some countries like India and China, which, by the way, by themselves are basically half the world, essentially. Maybe not half, but like a large percentage of the world. They seem to have gone down this path of like, we're going to restrict the usage of stablecoins and Bitcoin with sticks. Like, we're actually going to like jail you if you buy stablecoins or Bitcoin, right? And we're going to highly encourage the use of CBDCs. I think countries like that are kind of its own path, and they are, I think, quickly going to, well, maybe not quickly, because there's a lot of different, again, like what we mentioned, there's a lot of factors keeping the system together. Like, even we were talking about how the Chinese economy has gotten so bad, but a next natural question that some people ask me is like, well, does that mean the Chinese government's going to fall apart or something? And I'm kind of a little bit like, well, there's a lot of forces keeping that thing together, right? There's some forces that are dividing it, but there are definitely a lot of things keeping that thing together.
Same with all
Yeah.
different, fiat governments all over the world. There's just a ton of
Yeah.
gunk there to clear out. It's going to take a while.
Yeah, yeah, and I find it really interesting. You know, uh, even for us, like most Bitcoiners, I think were born kind of in the '90s or '80s, is a way I would kind of like roughly based off of like the kind of conversations I have. And I think one thing that's really interesting about that is we haven't really seen like a major. If you were born in the '80s or '90s, you haven't seen like a major geopolitical shift in your life. Like the world has always been dominated by the states to some degree, and there hasn't been like, yeah, sure. I mean, like for example, like Syria, we saw like a change in regime or something. There have been like minor changes, but your default has been more inertia than anything else. Like you have all these rulers that for every Suharto, which Suharto lost power in 1997, he was a kind of Indonesia's dictator. There has been Erdogan, who's also been around for like 19 or 20 years at this point, right? Like Iran's ruler, Ayatollah Khatam, the current Ayatollah has been around for 35 years. Like there's just been a lot of stasis and like staying together and inertia. And I think that the CBDC route countries, you're going to see this play out that like people just don't love CBDCs. They don't want it. And whether that is kind of like a final nail, I think it's a very poor decision for countries to embrace their own CBDC for like a number of different reasons. Like I also don't think they're executing them well. I think that it's going to require them to deploy sticks that will make them very unpopular. That might actually start this trajectory of people looking at like, well, we should look into Bitcoin or stablecoins or things like that. I actually think the big thing that will play out in the next 10 years is Bitcoin versus stablecoins. It's going to be the fiat system. I kind of assume this world where CBDCs are not going to work. And the real crux of the debate is going to be Bitcoin versus stablecoins. And you already see like all these different countries kind of Canada is not releasing a CBDC anymore, but they are, looking to talk with the states, and the states is obviously embracing, stablecoins, and is deciding not to do CBDC. So you might say like, hurrah, but it's like when the United States funded the Taliban way back in the day. Like your enemy's enemy, it doesn't necessarily mean they're your friend, and so I think that ultimately that's where you're going to see countries try to hold on to the dying fiat system with stable coins. And you're seeing that already in the States because, for example, like we kind of alluded to this, but Tether, I believe, it's above Germany. I forget exactly how much it is, but it is one of the largest holders of treasuries. And if you're looking at countries, like we were talking about Japan and China are selling their treasuries. So it's like, well, who's buying treasuries? Well, it's people who are using stablecoins. They are some of the largest net buyers of treasuries at this point, right? So it's like the U.S. and the fiat system is going to. I don't know when all this will come to pass. I just know that directionally speaking, like despite what the Trump administration is doing with Doge and all this other stuff, like they haven't attacked the core of the problem. The core of the problem is that all these countries are essentially in default. They just haven't realized it yet. They're like walking corpses because of demographics or other things. The United States has been able to extend its advantage to a certain degree because of demographics, actually, because it's the immigration hub of the world. But if you look at a country like Japan, Japan is super old, unproductive, like essentially returning negative return to bondholders and screwing elderly people out of funds, and like more and more does not have a functioning economy, right? To a certain degree. Like it's losing out in terms of value. Um, I think, you know, the thing, the state's extending its runway, though, is it just hasn't solved the fundamental problem, which is like, in order for there to be an actual non-default eventually, you have to like step back on two or three promises that the United States has made to the world and to its own citizens. So the states has Social Security, has Medicare, and has a significant military and foreign aid budget, right? These are the three main things. Military is the largest of discretionary spend, and then there's the non-discretionary spend, which basically you can't modify. Like it just keeps on, as Lynn Alden puts it, this fiscal train will keep on running, right? And
Nothing
so,
stops this train. That's
yeah,
her favorite meme.
nothing stops this train. So when we're talking about the train in the American context, it's actually really clear to me what these three things are. It's the military, foreign aid. It's the United States commitment to being the guarantor of like the world's waterways and security and world security architecture. It's the United States commitment to like its retired citizens. Like in the time of Lyndon B. Johnson, it was decided that despite really bad demographic forecasting, that we would have like a that the United States would have a partially unfunded retirement system, and which continually runs a deficit because Social Security payroll taxes do not pay for the Social Security trust, and there needs to be revenue from other sources. And then there's of course healthcare. So unless there's movement on these three, and you really need to like pretty much eliminate two out of three, maybe even, right? So unless you see movement in that, and you're not, I don't know, I don't think even you're going to see. There's just so many reasons why you wouldn't see movement on that. So just to give you an example of Trump, Trump has not, even though he has been one of the strongest at like, oh, we have to like fire a bunch of government employees. Like, sure, that will help like on the margins. It's like 2 or 3% or whatever. But you know, the main spend is these three items. And if you're like standing there and being like, well, we're not going to touch Social Security and we're not going to touch Medicare. And actually, in fact, we're going to increase military spending and we expect everyone in the world to increase military spending. Well, then it's like, then you're not, you know, so so you just this train just keeps on going. If anything, it's faster. So I think the United States and other countries are going to try to maintain its kind of dominance through these stable coins. And in the case of Europe, for example, the CBDCs, but it's just going to be like outright confiscation, and you know, people who live in these countries are just, it's just going to get worse and worse. Like I mean, for example, like some countries are going to have drafts, because I do think we are entering a period where there probably are going to be more wars. I can talk about why, but that's, yeah, like, I mean, just even anytime you see an ascendant economic power like China and the US has basically almost always ended up in war. And I don't see anything currently that's like kind of reeling that back, to be honest with you. Um, so, I'm not saying inevitably there will be a US China war, but I just think in general there will be more wars. And, when you look at President Trump, like, what Trump's saying is like, not only does the US have to spend more on defense spending, but like everyone else does too. Like everyone in NATO needs to spend 2% of GDP on defense. So to give you an example, like Europe is going to be in this really weird position where they've lost their energy imports, because they're cutting off Russia, the evilest country in the world. And at the same time, they're also, the Germans just said like, Germany used to have, they could not run a deficit. And they removed that because now they need to fund, quote unquote, the Green New Deal and also European defense. So it's like, well, you have all these countries that are just like going to go bankrupt, and like some of them are going to choose to embrace CBDCs and try to confiscate those funds. I think some of them are just going to like try outright taxation. And I think the big play is like people are going to realize this, and they're going to more and more try to go to like places kind of like Costa Rica maybe, or other countries, I don't know, and try to escape this madness. And countries are just going to be forced more and more to like use sticks to like try to keep these people around, right? Actually, the United States is one of the most interesting because they make you pay to rescind your citizenship, and taxation is based on citizenship, not residency, which is a very rare thing. But that is the privilege afforded to the United States, right? Other countries are probably going to think that they need to do similar things as well. So yeah, I think all this kind of comes together in my bull scenario, the scenario that I am very hopefully hopeful and optimistic about. It's like people realize that it's enough people over all these different populations realize like, hey, we've got the wool over our eyes, and we need to gravitate to trading with each other, being with each other, peer to peer financial independence, which then creates the ability for you to be independent in all parts of your life. And I think maybe new forms of government, maybe, um, and we live in a world where it's like nation states are kind of like the default, and I always find that kind of like really gnarly to think about. Like, there's this funny story I was talking with a friend of mine. There's this Italian guy who like declared independence, and I'm not saying like we should all become sovereign citizens right now in this moment or like whatever, but what I thought was so funny is that nation states are so prickish about state power that they actually went and like bombed this guy. Like this guy declared like a small parcel of unoccupied land to be like part of his, and then they ended up compromising. He kind of gave out at the end. I mean, it happens when you're getting bombed, but he was like they gave him like a driver's license or something without having his like real ID, or I don't know, whatever it was. They made a deal together, but to me, it's like nation states are kind of like a virus, that kind of like compete against each other. And we've lived in this virus for so long. So I kind of mentioned the generational thing that it's like it's hard to shake out of it. Like even like the most based out of all of us, we still live with like these state assumptions, right? Like even like one example I always put out is like I always feel, even though like I love non KYC, it always even still feels somewhat wrong if that's a weird thing to say. But it's like no, that's just like it's just the opposite of like what the controllers want, right? But because you've been so deeply imbued into this system of like, oh, you were handed a government ID, has your address on it, you got to pay taxes every year, you need to file that address accurately. If you do not do these things, then like the IRS is gonna go and like whatever they do, like waterboard you, or I don't know what the IRS actually does to people. I'm just kidding about the waterboarding. But like if that happens to you, you almost feel that kind of so even those of us, it's hard to like get rid of how much of the wool, even we have wool over our eyes. But my hope is that eventually we all, including a lot of the people that you were saying were trying the NPC path, kind of realize like things get so bad they kind of realize it, and then we organize in our different ways, and we're transacting with each other in sovereign Bitcoin, and that allows us the freedom of autonomy to create and be whoever we are. So that's kind of that's how I kind of think things will break down. But of course, I might have skipped over the like many wars, geopolitical turns of events, currency devaluations, panic buying, and all the other things that would ensue as part of that. Maybe.
I think that's an amazing answer. And I completely agree with the majority of your takes there. Essentially, just to summarize, the fiat future is the future of more, higher taxes, more inflation, funneling money into the war machine to go send more bombs over the Middle East if you're the US, and just all this nonsensical stuff money being spent on because the fiat money printer allows infinity money printer with no responsibility, and we're going to continue getting worse and worse, crazier outcomes from that until we adopt sound money, which is Bitcoin, which has restrictions on it, which
Yeah.
those who read the Bitcoin Standard by Seyfedin Moose know this, and your book as well, I'm sure it goes into this as well, where sound money comes into it, and it just forces responsibility onto leadership. And I think even the most blue pilled people I know are starting to ask questions about, man, I just don't think that these presidents really have my best interests at heart. And so
Yeah.
we just need to sort of help those folks see that every side, no matter where you are in politics, it's better if there's sound money, because then the side that you don't like isn't going to be able to ruin your life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
just
and,
just
and,
puts
and
more guardrails on things that make much more sense. And people don't understand how many of the problems that they complain about are
yeah.
due to the money being broken and inflation just stealing from everybody and putting all people in a more negative energy state because they're unable to save for the future. They're forced to think really short term. Their brains closed down. They're
Yeah.
spiritually bankrupt. All these things happen. It is happening worldwide right now. Just every single place you go, there's people going through similar struggles, and it's so sad to see. And this is why I really promote Bitcoin as a huge
Yeah.
solution to this. And another solution that I think is huge, which is maybe the last topic we could touch on, we sprinkled it in a little bit earlier, is
Mm.
Nostr. Because in order for us to create this, or just help angle humanity toward the positive Bitcoin path and not the fiat path of death and destruction, we need to have communication that works, and we need to be able to talk to each other and actually work together and
Mhm.
figure this thing out without those very same fiat lords controlling our speech through these big tech platforms like X and Instagram and LinkedIn and
Yeah.
Facebook and all these things where you can just be completely rug pulled at any time because these are capturable companies. So I'd love to hear your just overarching take on Nostr and what you've seen on the ground from looking at this and how it's unfolded in these different sort of regimes where censorship is happening. And I know that you've done a lot of writing about this on Forbes. That's where I think I first found you. Was I saw
Oh,
one of your
cool.
Forbes articles about Nostr and was just thinking, yes, like this is hitting the mainstream, baby, let's go. And so what are your thoughts on where Nostr fits into this big equation we're laying out for people?
Yeah, I mean, we'll start with kind of what you were saying. Like, I mean, in order to have fully independent, autonomous, like kind of speech and communications, like you kind of have to get it away from the platforms, right? And so we always talk about, protocols over platforms, and it's a very important point. And especially in some of the contexts we're talking about, like these different companies like X or whatever, like whatever your opinions on Elon, for me, the problem is that there is an Elon. It's not necessarily what viewpoints he may or may not have. That actually doesn't really matter to me as much. It's the fact that you have a person that can like decide what is good and what is bad, and that person can be inconsistent. Like I'm not like, for example, like X has censored some of the protests related to Turkey, right? And that's just because there might be personal relationships between like Erdogan and Musk or whatever. I don't really, what's important here is that you need something that preserves your ability to communicate, no matter what the powers that be say or do. And that's one of the things that Bitcoin has been really powerful for. What we've alluded to a little bit is that it has created its own ecosystem, because one thing is that I've written for a lot of mainstream outlets. And as I've written about Bitcoin more and more over the years, that has decreased because they just simply refuse to publish my stuff. But, but it's really important because people don't realize that, and it's not necessarily like, oh, the lizard people are out to get you, but it's a little bit more subtle than that. Like you have these mechanisms of control over the media, and the kind of like communications that you consume. Um, so almost like X is kind of like a stable coin, if I want to make kind of a little bit of a comparison there. Because your real CBDCs are kind of like, state media or private media that's really affiliated with the state. So yeah, like the thing with companies like X and stuff like that is that like they still control the narrative. They're a little bit more like, you can choose different perspectives. So at the state control media and like the media that's like really closely affiliated with the state, that like depends on the state for its survival, like i.e., for example, the New York Times, which lest we forget, released a bunch of quote unquote what they call misinformation about Iraq before the Iraq war, because they're beholden to national security state sources. So the media in general, I'm just making this as a comment, like is an institution of the state. Like is a lot of people are employed there. The owners of the media, for example, directly with Bezos in the Washington Post, tend to be members of that political society that have points of view or wealth they need to preserve and all this other stuff, right? So Bitcoin has, social media in general has allowed for more voices, more diverse voices to be platformed in ways that can't be explicitly controlled, at least at the point of origin, right? But of course, social media companies can also determine, they can, I really like this Aaron Schwartz quote. It's like, nobody can stop you from freedom of speech, but they can stop you from freedom of reach. And in many ways, that can be as important. So, of course, on X or anywhere else, you can say a bunch of different things. You will get like banned if it's like really bad per their standards or whatever. But generally, what they do with it is they just don't spread it anywhere wide, right? Um, and that is a deliberate decision by the platform. Like the platform decides what it wants to incentivize, right? And Jack has talked a lot about this, and his old role at X, and like one of the reasons why Nostr is so important is because that algorithm is much more peer to peer and much more neutral. With X, again, similar to stablecoin, you can be leaned on to promote the discourse a certain way. And that can include, removing certain posts, but it can also include deciding to only promote certain posts as well. So I think Nostr is a way to get out of that. So Nostr, I've written about it quite a bit. I'm also on there. One of the things that I think Nostr, it would be good to get from Nostr actually is more like day-to-day conversations of people from like around the world kind of thing. Because I'll talk a little bit about like in China, I actually scraped a bunch of Mandarin language notes. And people were just talking about their day-to-day lives. Um, the activity on, I was actually just talking with Vitor, who does Amethyst, and we were thinking about this like kind of like from a systems perspective, like how do you create the conversations? So Nostr allows us to have these free and unfiltered conversations, and essentially, it's actually it works the opposite way. It works so like how like every platform has its own different ethos. Like I feel like Nostr's thing is like once you say a thing, you just like can't delete it. Like it's the opposite because it's so focused on like no one can be censored that you actually can't censor yourself, which I find really funny actually. Like you can't delete your old notes. Like once it's out there, which I also find really funny. And then once you have a private key, it's your private key forever. So it's like it's just a system that's like very, or I mean not forever, but it's whatever
Yeah,
associated with
I tell
your.
people it's just like email. Like you can't delete an email after you send it. It's the same thing for Nostr. Like this is one of the protocol
Yeah.
trade-offs you have to understand.
No, but like I mean, yeah, and that's actually like a really good example too. I hadn't actually made that connection before explicitly, um, I think that's for me at least it's wonderful because that's how I would run a network, right? I mean, maybe like I regret like one or two notes, and I'm like, I wonder how this will reflect on me in like 10 years, but overall, it's like I think it's a wonderful thing. I think the thing with Nostr is to find ways to create. It has a lot of things going for it with a lot of genuine conversations, especially among people in kind of our circles, like Bitcoin circles. I think like the next challenge is to find ways to get like NPC like types of people to like kind of revolve around it, but not in a like blue sky kind of way, but kind of in a like, we just have day to day kind of conversations on here. And I can say that in China, that is actually kind of happening a little bit. Like people are talking about their day to day commutes. People are talking about things outside of Bitcoin because that's another thing that's kind of interesting is some of the language based kind of Nostr conversations are very wildly different than the standards. I mean, the English ones are kind of, Odell's like yelling at you in all caps, and then, sorry, I'm not gonna like name check many more people, um, but yeah, like we kind of have, yeah, and I've introduced different people to Nostr, and some of them, especially people who are like not really into Bitcoin, they've been a little bit like, whoa, what is this, right? So I don't know. I think Nostr is an awesome tool to build community, and I'm hopeful that similar to kind of what you were saying, that as more and more people realize, the Bitcoin case where it's like bad things are happening to them, like more and more people will realize the same thing with Nostr. Like, so for example, when Brazil took down X for a while, and because I also think the same thing as like governments trying to restrict your ability to uh, control your financial destiny because they're going to need that money and resource to fund wars and to fund all these other things. They're also going to do the same thing with like communication because more and more, the more sticks are presented, like the more it's going to suck to be stuck in these countries. Like for example, if there's like a draft or something, you're going to see like stuff that happens like in Russia and Iran and China, like they're gonna have to repress people's ability to communicate that openly, right? And they have been doing that already to some extent already, but it's just gonna get worse, right? In Canada or Europe, or you already see it with all this like, oh, this is like disinformation or misinformation or like whatever, and so I think that's just gonna get worse, and more people are just gonna have to flock to Nostr. That's actually like the larger thesis bet of Nostr, right? It's like ultimately all these platforms are gonna just start having to ban people and kick people out for content. And I see the struggle as being like, I think slowly that's emerging even in Bitcoin communities. Like there's still a lot of Bitcoiners. So it simultaneously has a lot of Bitcoin content, which I find annoying sometimes, which like, it'd be good to diversify a little bit. I love some of these accounts that are doing like, even in the English language, they're just like sharing their day to day. I think you interviewed one who's like the carnivore nurse or something, and she's kind of
Yeah,
doing her
yeah,
own thing
Lucy,
on
she's awesome.
Nostr. So, I love it when like people are just doing their own different things, right? And then I think, yeah, like simultaneously it has too much Bitcoin content, but then also there are some Bitcoiners who refuse to use Nostr still. So I find that kind of really interesting as well. So it feels like a kind of a struggle to get us all together and maybe like off X. Like I find like a lot of people are still using X. I still use X. It's kind of like a default. It's not like you have to get off it, but like, it's not giving roughly the same, if not more energy to Nostr than X. I think it would generally be a good thing. If we're trying to free the money, if we're trying to fix the money, we should also try to fix our platforms, our
Yeah,
communications.
it's
So
very similar to the same way that you talked about earlier. How even like the most based Bitcoin or libertarian out there is still, we have to keep a pinky toe in the fiat system because that's the way the world is right now. And I would say it's kind
yeah,
of similar in a Nostr sense where there are
yeah,
people that are deleting all their other accounts and going Nostr only. But for myself personally, the route that I'm taking is keeping those other accounts since I've built an audience on them and trying
yeah,
to strategically pull people over to Nostr using those audiences and try to just
yeah.
continue
There's definitely
sprinkling
different
it
schools
in
of
and playing
thought.
the stupid algorithm games. But it's much different now knowing that we have an end
Yeah,
game where there are no algorithm games that you have to play. You know exactly what you get on there, and the people will see your content because people actually have control over what they see, which is extremely awesome. And for that reason, I'm posting a lot more stuff on Nostr now than I am anywhere else because I know that I don't have
yeah,
to worry about facing algorithm punishment, and talking about day to day stuff, just songs I'm listening to, pictures of funny dogs and trees, and just random things I'm seeing throughout my life that if you put it up on Twitter,
yeah,
because that's not like a trending topic or something that's going to make people angry, you're going to get less engagement on that, and then you're going to get punished in the algorithm.
yeah,
And so it really de-incentivizes people from just being real. And it's crazy how much that really affects the way that you think and how much you share with the world. And I think that's so powerful, and it really changes the game for the the public discourse, which is now so wide open, and it's super exciting to me. And because I've seen that so many
yeah,
people go through the same process where they think, oh, this is just another social media thing, but when they come on there, they notice this huge mental awakening of like, wow, I didn't know how much I was even censoring myself before. Like I was really stopping myself from saying what I wanted to think or what I was actually doing because it was against the algorithm, and it sort of subconsciously wires you to think and act a certain way that's not really you. And this is why we're seeing such a beautiful flourishing of voices on Nostr, because they know that they can truly do whatever they want there, and people who follow them will get that content, and they can also zap them and reward them financially with sound money for what they're sharing
yeah.
with the world. It's just so beautiful. I love it.
Yeah, I love Nostr too, and that's why I've been writing so much about it, and I love to see it grow. I do think for it to reach like massive scale, it's gonna take kind of like what you alluded to. Like people are just gonna. I find it unfortunate, but people are just gonna have to live through like some of these events for themselves, and then they're gonna flock to like Bitcoin and Nostr en masse. But like the fact that Nostr is here and it's built, I find that really wonderful. And I think like as a technology, the two complement each other so well. Like And every Nostr npub address is actually, like to your earlier point, like is also kind of a SegWit address. And so the two like Bitcoin and Nostr really play really, really well together. And I've seen some pretty interesting things, like there's some Chinese people who are like zapping each other on Nostr, and I'm like, oh, I'm pretty sure this is illegal, but whatever, you do you. Um, so yeah, no, some really, really cool stuff. And yeah, just hopeful that Nostr is just a fun place right now. Love to do memes, love to get zapped, love to, buy my coffee with or I don't drink coffee, so tea, with some zaps. But I think eventually for some of the like big, for what it is now, I think it's like really great. Like, me, you having conversations, people like us, we're forming community, all this other stuff. For some of the stuff you were talking to me about, like more like where's Nostr in 10 years, that's kind of like where I see, those migrations that we're talking about. But it's just going to take time. I think just like the same thing with inflation that just kind of burst on the scene. It's just going to take time for people to live through all that and like to go through it all themselves before, all these things that we're talking about in this podcast. It'd be interesting to see what happens, like if you actually like look back at this 10 years from now, and how much we got right and how much we got wrong. Maybe we got everything wrong, but maybe we got everything right. So that'll be really
Exactly.
interesting.
That's why it's so fun. That's why I love just recording these things, knowing that they will be currently on the internet, that they will long outlive me, and we get to look back in the future and reminisce on all these predictions that we make and see how it all went down. But I know one thing for sure, I am extremely bullish on freedom technology because that's what the people
Yeah.
need, it's what the world needs, and it's also what I want to happen. So I'm biased. I'm going to continue pushing it hard and manifest it into existence because that's the future that we need. Roger, I could easily
Yeah.
talk to you with another hour, man. This is so interesting, but I think we should probably start wrapping things up here. We just hit the 2 hour mark, tons of signal for people to sink their teeth into. Why don't you finish us off here with just letting us know where people can find you, where they can go buy your book, Would Mao Hold Bitcoin, and any other things you'd like to drop for people to check you out here.
Yeah, no, for sure. And Ben, you're doing a great job out there. Like, I share your belief in freedom tech overall, and just having people like you, and just we're creating our own ecosystem here, and it's so important. And keep up the work, man. This is amazing. So myself, you can find me. Let's start with my Nostr. My NIP05 is loki at nostr-verify.com. But I also believe, I mean, you might want to link to it directly. I also have a Primal profile somewhere out there. If you just look up my name, actually, Roger H, because sometimes people tell me that like my NIP05 is hard to find. You'll probably find me. There's like a photo of like an old Chinese gentleman who is a famous Chinese writer. So you'll know that's the right place if you see that. And yeah, I am also still on X, Roger H 1991. I do have to specify the 1991. There are, as with X, and this is actually not the thing we covered, but there's a ton of fake accounts out there, which I find really ironic. So if you are going to follow someone, follow the non-verified one, who has a photo again of an old Chinese guy who's not me, I guess. So that's me on X, and yeah, the book is Would Mao Hold Bitcoin. I've got my website chinabitcoinbook.com. Going same thing with CBDC, just being as descriptive as possible here. Um, and what are you getting when you click on this site? Well, you're getting a site about a China Bitcoin book. But yeah, it has some more resources about some of the stuff we covered, like for example the exact timeline of bans and things like that. And yeah, you get the book pretty much everywhere, like Amazon. There's like an ebook version. I'm also around with like physical events, so I also tend to sign them if I see you, and I just take payment directly in Sats. That usually is a cooler option for most people. So just off the top of my head, I'll be in Prague for BTC Prague. I'll be at Bitcoin 2025, and I'll be at Bitcoin is for Everyone in Portland, and want to pump up learning Bitcoin in Vancouver. And there's probably a few others that I'm thinking about, but yeah, those would be like the big ones for now. And yeah, otherwise, Ben, super. Yeah, we went the distance, man. 2 hours, 2 hours and 14, and really appreciate all the energy and time you put into the show, man.
Appreciate you, man. It's been a huge pleasure for me as well, and I do look forward to reconnecting in the future because we threw out quite a few predictions here, sort of thoughts, and I love revisiting those later. So maybe kick the can out a year or something, see if some of these things start unfolding the way we think they will. We'll see how it goes, but yeah,
Yeah.
Roger Wang, appreciate you, man. We'll be in touch. I'll see you in Vegas. I'm going to be there too, so we'll have to connect for something.
Yeah, let's make sure we connect, man. I'll be staffing the book signing table most of the time. So, I
Amazing.
mean, you'll
Okay.
see me around.
Awesome. I'll be there. We'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks a lot, Ben.